Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel, What the Beck. Today we are going to be assembling your JSK out of the pattern that you drafted with me in part 1, the first video that I made about this. I don't have anything really pretty to show you right off the bat because I'm not done making it yet as I'm filming, but basically make sure you have all of your pieces cut out. The cutting guide was at the end of the last video. That should tell you how many pieces of each material you will need. You need fabric, interfacing, a lining, and then a sewing machine and thread, as well as pins and scissors. But that's really it, and maybe also a cat. So the first thing that you're going to do is take all of your pieces of the bodice in both your fabric and interfacing, and you should have 3 of these, 1 front piece and 2 mirrored side pieces. Pin them together with the bumpy side of the interfacing facing the wrong side of the fabric. So if you feel it like this, it should be smooth, but if you feel the part that's touching the fabric, it should be rough. So these are all pinned together, and we are now going to go iron these from the fabric side. So don't iron it with the interfacing facing up, iron it with the fabric facing up, and I'm going to go do that and come right back. You will also want to have a plan for what your finished JSK is going to look like, as well as ribbons and lace as you see fit for your design. So I have ironed the interfacing onto my pieces and I have lined them up. It's really hard to see. I can't get a good angle with my phone, but I have the side here, the middle, and the other side on this side, all with the fabric facing up. And now, as my cat is going absolutely nuts in the background, we're going to flip one side over and pin it along this edge. Once we do that, we're going to flip this other side over and pin it along this edge. If you want lace going up the seam on your bodice like I have planned here, you will want to sandwich that in between the layers. So let me show you how to do that. You're going to basically make sure that your lace has enough seam allowance space as you need, plus extra that will show out the front, and kind of just like imagine it by covering your finger over about what would be the seam allowance. So I am eventually going to ruffle this, but just for the demonstration I'm going to lay it flat like this with the flat side on the flat side of the bodice, and then you would line this up and pin it down, and then you are going to sew over this seam and this seam on the side. So here's what it looks like after I ran it through the machine. As you can see, I gathered some lace and stuck it in there, so that way on the front of the dress there will be some lace. And if you do put lace, you should top stitch it. So you would basically iron it in the direction that it should go. So in this case I'm going to press them going outward, and then just sew, like put it on the machine like this and push it forward and make a line of stitches just next to the seam. That way it will hold the lace down. So I'm gonna go do that. And at this point, if you want to add any detailing to the bodice, so like sewing on small bows, if you want to add like lace shaping like I did on the pink JSK, you can do that now, because once you add the lining, the stitching that you make to attach it here won't show. So anything you have to hand sew or any little details you want to put them on now, and do any top stitching if you put lace in the seam. So most of my interest on this dress is going to be in like a big bow on the waist and on the skirt. So I only added a ribbon bow up here. As you can see, I hand stitched that on. But the next step will make it so that that stitching is encased in the bodice and it won't like rub against your blouse or anything, so it probably won't come out. If it does, you can just sew it back on. But anyway, the next step is to put the lining together the same way that we did the outer part of the bodice. So you have your middle piece and side and the other side in the same way. So basically we're just going to flip that over, pin it up the side, flip this one over, and pin up this side, and then sew along both of them. Don't add lace into the lining because the lining is against your body, so it doesn't need to look pretty. It's just, we're gonna sew the seams and then come back. So I sewed my lining. We're going to place the lining and the bodice to the side and pick up the pieces that you cut for your straps. So they are the 3-inch wide ones. The 2-inch wide ones are for your waist ties, so don't pick those up. Pick up the wider ones. So I have mine folded up here. So take one. You're going to fold it in half lengthwise, pin along the edge, and then sew along the edge. And we're going to sew these with a 1/2-inch seam allowance. The way that works out is you'll get about an inch wide strap. And then do the same with the other piece, just fold it in half and sew along the side with 2 raw edges. Okay, so here's what it looks like when it's sewn. The next step is a little bit frustrating. It's probably the most frustrating part, but basically take a safety pin and pick up a couple places on the fabric, and then we need to turn it inside out. So just turn the safety pin to go inside of the fabric like this, and then you kind of have to hold the safety pin on one end through the fabric, and you can see where it ends there. Just push more fabric onto it and move your other hand up, and as you continue basically gathering fabric on here, you can pull on the end gently so that you don't rip your stitches out, but basically you pull on it and keep gathering and pushing the safety pin forward. Let me see what's going on here. See, this is why it's frustrating, because you can't really see what's going on. But basically, as the safety pin travels inside of it, the fabric will follow and turn itself inside out. Here you go. You kind of have to grab only the outside layer and pull it over the inside layer, which is really weird. You can also just pull on the seam allowance like so. I'm just going to show you this whole thing so that you're prepared for when you have to do it, that it's going to be a little bit frustrating. And yeah. Okay, so now it's at the other end. Hold the safety pin through the end of the thing and just pull the seam allowance so that the inside, well, it basically turns inside out. And once one side is out, you can take the safety pin off and basically just it's so frustrating, but once these are over, you only have to do it again for the waist ties. But yeah, there's only 4 pieces that you have to do this for, so you just gotta get them over with. Okay, so there's one inside out. Do that to the other one, and then iron these with the seam in the middle. So it should look like this, and the other side would look clean like that. Just keep the seam in the middle of the piece and iron it flat. And do the same for the other piece. Now I've got to go turn this one inside out. So they are now pressed with the seam in the middle of the backside. Now what we're going to do is take our bodice with the pretty side up. Then you are going to lay your strips or straps wrong side up, not right side up, so you should be able to see the seam. Line them up with the seam between the side and front of the bodice and pin that on just for now with like one pin, and then put the other side on. Like this. You don't need too much extra fabric sticking up here. I just put a little bit for like extra security so that it won't like rip off. But the reason we pin them with the wrong sides up is that when we sew them, they'll be flipped up, and then the right sides will be up on the final piece. So now that the straps are pinned in place, we're going to take our lining, place it on top, basically making a big sandwich, and the raw edges should be on top of the piece, so the nice looking edges will be on the inside. Now we're going to pin and sew only around the armpit, across the top, and the other armpit. Don't sew the sides and don't sew the bottom. So pin and sew the top and the armpit parts, and then we'll go to the next step. I'm finished sewing along the top and the armpits, and now we just have to turn it the right way around. So to do that, I'm basically using the straps to help me pull the points out like this. And once you turn it inside out, you are going to want to iron it again on the seams that you just made to help it lay flat. So make sure that the seam is all the way at the edge and iron it so that it stays like that. Now we're going to do the waist ties the same way as the straps, but you're going to sew it with very little seam allowance, because if you sew it with ½ an inch like I was before, then you will have less than ½ an inch to turn inside out. So sew it as close to the edge as you possibly can, and then turn them inside out and iron them flat the exact same way as the straps. Now that they're flat, we have 2 ends that are raw, but one is going to show at the end of the waist tie. So to finish it off, you basically just have to fold it inside itself like this, and it's helpful to use something small to actually turn the ends inward. But once you get them in there, you can either hand sew it shut, or you can run it through the machine. But if you use the machine, make sure that you leave long tails and tie them off on both ends. That way it won't come undone. So I'm gonna go do that and come back. So I have chosen to do mine on a machine, right at the very end. Don't need really seam allowance, it's just to close it up so that it's not a raw edge. And that was only on one side of each of these because this side will be encased in the dress later. So you only need to do that to one on each waist tie. You're going to take your back panel. Mine is still folded from when we cut it out. The reason that the back panel doesn't need a lining is because it is its own lining. So this piece is actually twice as tall as it needs to be, so keep it folded in half. And it should be a long rectangle like this. And now you need to decide how many rows of shirring you want. I guess the only deciding factor here is how much do you need to make it look even. So in this case, my piece is the final piece without seam allowance will be about 5 inches. So let's see, I could maybe do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rows of the shirring. One every half inch, that takes up a half inch of space. If your back piece is longer, you may want more. If it is shorter, you may want less. Basically, I'm just going to mark that out now with pins. Also remember that this top part here should be your first row of shirring. So this will be the first one that has elastic in it. Because it's folded, we don't have a seam allowance. So I'm going to mark 1/2 inch. And that will be where my first row goes. And then every subsequent 1/2 inch I'm going to mark it. So basically every other row of these is going to have the elastic. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And the bottom I left open because you still need the seam allowance down here. That way you can sew it onto the skirt. But basically what you're going to want to do is extend these lines across the whole thing. You can do this with washable pen, but if you don't have that, you can just as easily use pins to mark the whole thing. And then as you are sewing into the machine, basically your presser foot will be going straight towards them. Just pull them out as you go so that you don't run over them. And try to keep your stitches as straight as possible for this part, because in the end it will make it look a lot nicer. But yeah, so mark out your channels, make sure that you can fit the elastic through them. So I have elastic that will fit through a 1/2 inch channel, but if you don't, just put your elastic on top, measure how wide it needs to be, and evenly space the channels on the fabric. Okay, so I've just sewn all my lines. It's kind of hard to see, both because the thread is the same color as the fabric, and that the fabric itself has lines. But I marked with a pin each, every other row starting from the top, which is folded, and those are the rows that will contain the elastic. Now what we're going to do is fold this in half, and that is the length of elastic you're going to cut. So here I have my 1/2 inch elastic. I will measure it, and we do this because you need room for it to stretch, and it can stretch all the way to the full length, but you need it to be less in order for it to be stretching to fit you. So however many channels you have, cut that many lengths of elastic without getting pins stuck in your scissors. That one's just barely too short, but I don't want to waste it, so I'm still gonna use it. I'll just put it at the bottom row because that's where my waist is, and my waist is smaller than my bust, so it makes sense that it would be a smaller piece down there. So now, unfold this back to the way it was. This is my smaller piece. And we're going to thread the elastic through the casings, or the channels, the same way as we did for the straps. So basically you put the, actually I'm going to put it up a little higher. Don't put it up too high because it might rip through the elastic and then that won't be fun to fix. But basically you put it on here, insert your safety pin into the top row, once you have it in there, you're gonna gather and pull the fabric along the elastic. Try not to twist your elastic because that can cause some funky situations with the wearing of the garment. It will be a little less a little bit more uncomfortable. Keep this end hanging out, and then once you get the other end to pop out of the other side, you need to take a pin and pin the elastic in place. Then you can remove the safety pin. Take another pin and then very carefully stretch this until the end reaches the end of the elastic, and that's pretty close but not just yet. And pin it in place like so, and then repeat that for the rest of the channels. Again, every other one. So this next one won't have elastic, this one will. And that's, the pins help you know which one is which. Okay, so here's what my panel looks like when I have put my elastic through 5 channels. I'm not exactly sure what's happening with this elastic. I had extra on every row, but I was just intending for it to be a rectangle, so whatever amount of elastic needed to be in each channel to make it be an even rectangle is what I allowed it to have in there. It just needs to be able to stretch to. Now we're going to take this back to the machine and very carefully sew these elastics in place. So you can just do a line down each row, and I recommend using small stitches, so like nothing bigger than a 3mm stitch, because that way it will hold the elastic down in a very multiple places, a lot of places, instead of just like having 1 or 2 stitches in there. And also sew this as close to the edge as you can while still getting the elastic in there, because later when we sew the seam, stitches to hold the elastic down won't be seen at the same part of the seam. It's weird, but it works. So I just finished sewing close to the edge, but still enough to trap the elastic in there, and now we have our stretchy back panel. I think mine is a little small, so I might have to not redo it, but just like add another little bit of fabric. Now what you're going to do is take your bodice and you're going to kind of open up the bottom. So these are the sides. We're going to fold these in just a little bit and pin them in place. And we are then going to iron these. So do this to both sides. So the right side is being folded in a little bit to meet the wrong side. And then iron it so that it stays like that. Now that that is pressed, so on both sides, I have the right side folded in to the wrong side. We're going to make sure that it still folds at the seam because the seam allowance kind of wants to fold on itself, but we're going to take, let's see, find which side of your shirring panel is the right side, so the side that will be facing out. And if your fabric has a pattern on it, you want that to be the side where the fabric pattern is the right way up. So like if you have little foxes on it, they'll be upside down if you use one side, and they'll be right side up if you use the other side. So okay, my cat's just messing around. Okay, so now we're going to basically find the right side. We're going to have the bodice right side down, so the pretty side is facing the table. Bodice right side down, and we're going to sandwich it between those two layers and pin that in place. And make sure on the other side that you're catching that front side of the fabric in there too. And it's easier to pin it on the rows that don't have the elastic, so kind of line it up on those rows. Make sure you catch both sides and then come back up. And we're going to repeat that on the other side, but fold it so that your pins, like fold it so that like as if it was already connected, but your pins are on top, so that when you put it through the machine, your pins aren't on the inside, so you can't see where they are to take them out. And then we're just gonna pin the other side the same way. Okay, so that's finally done. So you should have pins on both sides, and make sure you grab the liner on one side and the right side of the fabric on the other. And now you're going to sew close to, but not like extremely close to, the edge of the fabric right here. So you will be sewing like down this side on that side and down that side on this side, if that makes any sense. Hopefully you can see it. You're going to be trapping the back panel between these two layers here. And one thing to note is to not sew all the way down. You want to leave the amount of seam allowance that you need at the bottom. So for me it's 1/2 inch. I'll be sewing down until there's a 1/2 inch of space left. And that's so that when we attach the skirt, the seam will be clean. Okay, so at this point you have your back panel attached. So you should have no raw edges on either the front or back side. And you have to make sure that at the bottom of the piece, which is the only piece that, or the only area that has raw edges, you need to make sure that your two layers, your lining and your fabric, can separate 1/2 inch. That's my seam allowance. I also suggest that you do that seam allowance for this section. But make sure that the points where it attaches it can open up 1/2 inch. And the same on the other side. There will be 2 sides it needs to be able to open up. You also should have the back panel still open, so 2 layers, and the rest of the bodice obviously has the front and the lining, which are 2 layers. Now what you're going to do is put the bodice aside and grab your skirt. So my cat has clearly been sitting on this because of all the hair that's on it, but that's fine. You have a skirt piece that is a lot longer than it is wide, and what you're going to do is hem the bottom. So pick a long side of the fabric to be the bottom. You're gonna fold it up 1/2 inch and then fold it up another 1/2 inch and pin it all the way around like so, and that will be the bottom of your skirt. So you're going to pin it by folding up 1/2 inch and then up another 1/2 inch. Do it along only one long side of the piece, and then sew it on the machine close to but not on the top edge, and that will keep it up. So now the skirt is hemmed. It should look like this. This is going to be the underside of the skirt, and the other side will be on the outside of the skirt. So now that you have the hem done, if you are going to add lace to the bottom, now is the time to do it. You can add it on the front or under this if it's like a contrasting color. That might be better to attach it underneath. Mine is going to be just plain white, so I'm going to put it on top and kind of gather it a little bit as I go to make it more like textured and interesting looking. Make sure you refer back to your drawing. So on my drawing it has 4 ruffles, so if I still want 4 ruffles, I should evenly space them on my fabric, and if I decide that that's too much or not enough ruffles, then I'll just modify that on my final piece. But basically, plan it out what you want it to look like, pin any lace on, or if you're doing pockets, pin your pockets on, and then sew it on, and then we'll do the next step. Okay, I just added a ton of lace to this in evenly spaced stripes along the fabric. So my skirt decoration is pretty much done at this point. I may add another row of lace up here, but I'm not sure yet. But at this point, preferably before you decorate the like waist area of the skirt, you want to put your petticoat on and try it on. So put the top of it at your waist and see if it falls where you want it to on yourself. If you need more length, that's why I told you to put an inch extra. But I keep finding that when I make these, they're always a little bit too long, and then the petticoat doesn't hold them up at the bottom. So I took like 2 or 3 inches off of mine. Just whatever 2 of these stripes was too much. So I took them off, and now it's the right height, so make sure you do that. Now what you need to do is take either your own hands and a thread and needle and make a large running stitch across the top and pull the fabric to kind of gather it like that, or use your machine's basting function that basically makes long stitches that you can then pull to gather it. I don't prefer using the machine because every time I try it snaps the thread, so I usually just take the fabric in a thread and needle by hand, and I do sections and I gather it. And I usually split the circumference of the fully stretched out bodice around the bottom, measure that, I divide it by 6, and then I fold the skirt into 6 equal pieces and gather it until each section is 1/6 of the length of the bodice when fully stretched out. Now you're going to join the skirt into a circle, so lay it, it's like a huge piece of fabric, but lay it with the right side up and definitely make sure it's not twisted. So just drop everything on the floor and then fold it over on itself like this, so the inside has the front of the fabric or any lacy bits, and then you're going to pin along the short edge and make sure that you pin any lace that's in there into the seam as well, because that will make it really easy to make sure that it gets caught in there and it won't be just like a frayed edge of raw lace. So pin the side, sew up the side, and then do the next step. Make sure you've got both of your waist ties, your bodice, which you should turn right side out if you haven't already, so the pretty side should be facing out as if you were already wearing it, and your skirt, which should still be inside out from sewing it. This is the seam. See, so the seam is on the side we can see, which means it's wrong side out. Find the gathered edge, so mine is up here. You're going to insert, make sure you grab all of the straps, every bit of the straps, put them inside the skirt. Let me see if I can get this better. We're basically putting the bodice inside of the skirt like this. So one thing you might want to keep an eye on is where the seam of your skirt is, so I'm going to try to find mine real quick. Okay, so mine is on this side over here. I want to line that up with the seam of the side piece and the back, so I'm just going to open up this lining here, and I'm going to pin the part with the seam to this part just so that they match up. When I make these with zippers, I usually put it at the back because the back seam can be sewn at the same time as the zipper, but that's not what we're working on today. So once you have your seam pinned where you want it to be on the final piece, we're going to kind of maneuver it so that your hand is under the back shirring like this, and we're going to fold these pieces up, the pieces from the lining of the back, just to get them out of the way. And we're doing this because when we sew the skirt on, we don't want to catch the lining in that, because the lining is what hides the final raw edge, and we need that to be loose and not sewn in, because if we sewed it, it would make it part of the final raw edge. So we're just gonna go along and pin these up, and you only need to pin the lining of the back shirring up because the lining from the front and side panels are actually loose enough that you can just fold them out of the way while you're sewing. Do you see how that's easily falling off while you're sewing these two? But just pin up the fabric from the lining on the back shirring panel. Once you're done with that, we need to evenly space the gathers. So we're gonna kind of shove that lining back in there so we don't catch it when we pin. But basically we're just going to evenly spread the gathers out. And remember to stretch the back while you're pinning it to make sure that the whole area has gathered bits. Once you get to the point where the back panel is fully attached to the skirt fabric, you want to add your waist ties. So find the end that is unfinished, so in this case it's this one, and if you want you can like measure these out. I'm not super concerned about it because they started as the same length, so yeah, mine are still the same length. So I'm going to put this basically right after the back panel ends, and that's just because the back panel is so thick with all the elastic and stuff that it's kind of hard to add something like this. But the same way we did with the sleeves, roll up the end that has the nice finishing on it, put it into the skirt between the skirt and the lining of the bodice, and just pin it in place when you pin the lining down. If you only put one pin, it can be kind of crooked, so I suggest using two. Just put two pins in that like hold on to it basically. Make sure you don't catch the lining, it's trying to sneak in there. Okay, and then repeat the same for the other side. So find the end that is unfinished, take the finished end, put it in between the skirt and the bodice, and then pin it in place between the lining and the skirt fabric with two pins just for safety. Again, checking that the lining fabric is not in there. And then the next part is just really easy. You just match this up all the way around. If the gathers are a little loose like mine are, I tend to make them loose because you can always make them tighter, but if they're too tight you have to cut it and gather it again. You can just pin little sections closer together like this, so like put a pin every once in a while. And you might need a lot of pins, but it will fit there. So now that you have it pinned all the way around, with the lining of the top and sides loose and the lining of the bottom pinned up, you are going to sew around the whole thing. And be careful and take your time, because especially if you're working with a thick fabric like cotton, all these gathers make a lot of thickness, and you should be nice to your machine. Don't try to speed it through there. So now that that's done, the skirt fabric is sewn to the bodice fabric, but not the lining. So I'm going to start on the back where the shirring is, and we're just going to unpin the lining that we put up. That was just to keep it out of the way for that first step of attaching the skirt. So this next step, we are going to be folding the lining down over the seam that we just created, and that will hide the raw edges on the inside of the garment. Okay, you are not helping. Okay, so it helps to have the whole dress inside out at this point, because you kind of need to be able to reach your hand in there and make sure it's aligned correctly. So you want it so that the skirt fabric with the raw edge is pointing upward, and then you're going to fold your lining fabric and then fold it down on top of that, and make sure you get it pretty tightly and pin it down. And we're gonna do that around the whole thing. The only difference from the back when you're doing like the front and the sides is that your lining isn't like directly attached there, so you kind of have to be mindful of how much lining you fold down. So for example, I know my seam allowance was 1/2 inch, so I know that I can only really take up 1/2 inch when I fold it, and then when I lay it down on top of where the seam is, it's gonna only be allowed to have 1/2 inch. And the other thing is, at these corners here, there's some parts where they overlap, and you may have to trim the fabric a little bit to get it to actually go under. So it says the lining has to fold down and then over the other part like that. And make sure when you check from the front that you like aren't pinning any pieces down. Like for me, I have to make sure that this top row of lace isn't getting pinned into the seam, and you might have like little bows or something that have ends. You might need to pin the ends of the bows out of the way when you're doing this part so that they don't get caught in that seam. So yeah, we're just going to do that all the way around, and then we're going to put it through the machine again and sew down along this folded edge here, and that will trap all the raw edges in there. You don't really need to use a specific seam allowance at this point. Just get it so that your needle is like barely next to this but still on top of it, barely next to this edge over here. Now I continue pinning. So as you can see, I did mine on the machine and it kind of left this little edge here. If you don't like that, you can hand sew it instead, and make sure you only catch the underside of the fabric. But I don't mind this because I'm gonna have a big waist bow here, so it's okay. It's okay. Okay, so I don't have the greatest visual right now because I'm in a different room, but the next step is to try on your JSK and have someone help you find where the straps go in the back. So yeah, I really can't show this that well, but you want them to put it, I would say not at the edge of the shirring, but maybe 1 or 2 inches in from both sides, and then have them tack them down, take it off, and then either make a buttonhole in the strap there, or just sew it straight onto the piece. I prefer to sew mine to the piece because I make these custom fit to myself for a reason. I don't plan on selling them, so that's what I'm gonna do. But if you want to make it adjustable so that people of different heights or sizes can wear it, you can put buttonholes and even multiple buttonholes, and then just whenever you cut the strap, turn the ends inward the same way that we did for the ends of the waist straps, waist ties, whatever they're called. And finally, you can add any detachable things like bows or flowers or something like that, and then you're done your JSK. It's really hard to get the whole thing in shot, but I like how this turned out. I actually did all of this ruffling by hand, like every inch on the machine, so a lot of time and work went into this, but overall pretty happy with it. Good dress.